Hey everybody, and welcome back to Front-End Expert. In this video, we'll be looking at how we can create animations using just pure CSS. So if we take a look at this example, all we have is a div with the text animations inside of it. And then if we go to our styles.css, we're just adding a few styles to the div to make it easier for us to see. So we have a light blue background color, we give it a width of 30%, a height of 6 em, a border radius of 12 pixels to round the corners, 12 pixels of padding, as well as 4 em of margin just to push it away from the edge of the screen. Now, if we want to create a CSS animation, there are two different ways we can do this. First is with the transition property, and what the transition property does is it allows you to transition from one property value to another. So for example, we could take our width and we could expand it to a larger width, and then there would be a smooth transition between those values. And second, we have the animation property, which gives us a bit more granular control of how everything is working, but let's start by making a transition. So what I want is for the width of this div to change, but only when it's been hovered. So let's say div with the pseudo class of hover, we want to change the width. So let's make the width, say 50%. Now when I hover my mouse over the div, you see it gets bigger, and then when I let my mouse off, it gets smaller, which this is what we expect with the CSS we wrote. But I want this to be smoother. I don't want it to just jump to those values. I want it to smoothly transition from one value to the next, and we can do that with the CSS transition property. To go ahead and create that transition, we will come back up to this div rule set, and we can add a new declaration for the transition property. So transition property says, what are we going to transition on? Which property value pair do we care about? In this case, it is width. And then we can also add a transition duration to say how long do we want this to take. For example, let's say 1 second, which we just use the letter S for. And when I save this, now if I hover over the animation, you'll see it slowly transitions over 1 second in both directions. So anytime the width value is changing, we get this smooth transition. Now on top of these two properties, there are two other properties that we can define with transition. So first we have the transition timing function. And what a timing function is it defines how exactly this is going to happen. Is it going to be perfectly smooth and linear, or should it ease in and then ease out, or maybe something completely different? And there's a few different keywords we can use here. For example, linear, we'll make this a linear timing function. So the speed will never change. It will linearly go from 30% width to 50% width. And now if I hover over the div, you'll see it is expanding in a linear fashion, meaning that the speed is constant. However, I could change this back to ease, which is the default value, and now you'll see it will sort of increase in speed in the middle, and the same thing in reverse. And there are a few different timing functions we can use, as well as we can create custom ones using the cubic Bezier, and we will see that all in a moment, but for now we will leave this on ease. And finally, we have one last property here, which is the transition delay. And what this says is how long to wait until running the transition. So for example, I can say 1 second here. So now if I hover over the div, you will see it takes 1 second before running the transition. And the same will happen when I remove my mouse from the div. It will take 1 second before running that transition. And finally, there is a shorthand notation we can use here. So we can simply say transition, and then set the transition property, followed by the duration, the timing function we want, and then the delay we want. And this will do the exact same thing as this code here. So I'll go ahead and comment this out. So now you might have the question of what if I wanted to transition more than one property, not just the width? For example, if we come down to hover and we say we also want to add a transform property, and transform is a property that we use a lot with transitions and animations. It allows us to just move elements around on the page. And maybe in this case, we want to rotate and say 180 degrees. And when we save this, it's not going to work just yet because our transition is only transitioning the width. So there's two ways we can solve this. One, we could set this to all, which would just say transition every single value that changes, or we can use a comma separated value. So I could say width, and then comma, and then what we want for the transform. So we can say transform, and then we just set the same values again. So for example, maybe I want the duration on this one to also be 1 second. I want the timing function to also be ease, but I want the delay to be 0. And we could also just leave off the delay, but I'll add 0 explicitly here. And now we will have two different transitions. So we will have the width transition will take 1 second. And then we have the transform transition, which will also take 1 second, but it will happen first because it has no delay, whereas the with transition has a 1 second delay. And now if I hover over the animation, we'll see it rotates first and then it changes the width. And if I remove my mouse, we'll see it rotates back and then it changes the width back, because the rotation will always happen first because that is the one that has no delay on it. Now that is all there really is to CSS transitions. They're very straightforward and easy to work with, but at the same time, they are very powerful and usually can account for most of the animation type effects that we want, especially when we want an animation based on the state, which is usually the hover state, but not always. It can be different states, and it can also be controlled by JavaScript. So maybe a button is clicked and then we add some CSS class that creates this transition for us. However, sometimes we do need more granular control than that, and we need a little bit extra functionality, and for that we can use the animation property. So I will remove these transition properties, and let's start looking at how we can create animations. So to create an animation, we will come down here and do @keyframes, and then we give it a name. So for example, let's just call this move. And then we can open the keyframes using the curly braces. So now within these keyframes, we define what all of the different values will be for the animation at different points in time. So for example, 50% of the way through the animation, let's add a transform property. And let's say 50% of the way in, it is transformed to translate, which is just going to move it in both the X and Y direction. Let's say we've moved it in the X direction 200 pixels, but maybe we haven't moved it in the Y direction at all. Next, from here, we can add another keyframe. So let's say at 100%, so the end of the animation, we want a transform property. And we want this one to translate as well, but let's change the values once again. So maybe here, we still want 200 pixels on the X, so our X axis isn't going to change in the end of the animation, but we want to move down on the Y axis, so let's say 300 pixels on the Y axis. And we can save this. And now we need to come back up to our div, and we need to define the animation property to say which animation are we using. So we can use animation name first to choose which animation we want, and we called it move. And then we can give it an animation duration, which let's say that this is going to take 3 seconds. And now when I save this, you'll see the animation will run, moving the div over 200 pixels, and then it moves it down 300 pixels, and then once the animation is done, it just returns back to its starting point. However, we might want the element to stay at the ending value from the animation rather than jumping back to where it was. And the way we can do this is with animation fill mode, which is a property that allows us to do just that. Choose if the element will stay where it ended, and as well at the beginning of the animation if it should jump to where it is supposed to start from or if it should just already be there. So we can say forwards here, and what this will do is it will keep the value at the ending point of the keyframes. So at the end of the animation, the element stayed with a translate property of 200 pixels and 300 pixels rather than jumping back to where it started. Next, there are a few other properties that we can take a look at. So for example, we could do animation direction, which will choose which direction it animates in. So I could say reverse, and now you'll see it animates in the opposite direction from what it was doing before. We can also set an animation iteration count, which says how many times to run the animation. So for example, if I set this to 2, it will now run this animation twice rather than just running it once, and then after those 2 times, it will stop animating. We can also change this to a value of infinite. And what infinite does is it just runs the animation indefinitely. So as long as this page is open and the CSS is not changed, this animation will just keep running. But I'm going to change this back to a value of, let's say 2, and just have it run twice. Next, we can set what we call the animation play state. And this is either paused or running. So if we set it to running, it's going to do exactly what we expect. It's going to continue running the animation. But if I change this to paused, it's going to stop the animation where it was changed to paused. And this is super useful with JavaScript. If we ever want to stop an animation, have a button that the user can click and stop it, we can add this animation play state property via JavaScript. But we don't tend to use this directly in CSS too often, because if we don't have some JavaScript to change the value, then it's either just not going to play at all, or it's going to be the default state of running. But I can go ahead and switch this back to running so that our animation can run again. And finally, just like we could with transitions, we can set a timing function. So we will use the animation timing function, and we will set this to the same values that we could use in transitions. So for example, I could set this to linear, and now we will get a linear timing function. as well as I could use a different value like ease in, ease out, etc. We can also create custom timing functions using the cubic Bezier function. And I'm not going to go into the exact mathematics behind this function because you usually won't be expected to know it in detail, and likely you will use the developer tools to come up with a good set of values. But to briefly explain, this refers to a function on the xy plane. The steeper the slope in the function, the faster the animation will run at that portion of the animation. And these functions default to a linear function with 2 points, one being the origin and the other being 1, 1. And then in the cubic Bezier CSS function, we define 2 sets of xy coordinates in the range of 0 to 1 that determine the rest of the points that make the shape for the function. So for example, we can set the first point to 0.2, 0.6, and the second point to 0.6, 0.2, and this will create a somewhat interesting function that slows down in the middle. So now when I save this, you'll see the animation changes to follow this new timing function curve. All this said, I wouldn't worry too much about cubic Bezier. You should know what it is and its purpose, but most of the time you won't be coming up with these values by hand. And finally, along with the cubic Bezier, we can also use a steps function. And what the steps function does is it allows us to just say how many steps there should be between the values rather than doing a smooth transition. So for example, steps of 3, and we can see now the element is just sort of jumping across the screen rather than it smoothly transitioning between the values. And now lastly, with animations, we do have a few shorthands that we can use, just like we did with transitions. So instead of using this entire set of properties, we can just use the animation property, and then this will take the name. So in this case, it was called move, and then we can add all of the values. So the first time that you add will be the duration. So we can say 3 seconds, then we can add the various values. And then we had a iteration count of 2, it was running, and we wanted steps of 3. And we'll see that this is now the exact same thing. So I can comment this out and we get the exact same animation that we had before, because again, this is just a shorthand notation for these values. And lastly, there is some shorthand notation within the keyframes as well. So rather than 100%, we can call this 2. And we can also add a value that is from, and from will be equal to 0%. So for example, we could say from and add one more property here, and maybe this one will just be 0 pixels, 0 pixels, and it is going to do essentially the same thing we had before, except now we're using this from and to value to equal 0 and 100%. So that's going to do it for this video on CSS animations and transitions. They are incredibly powerful tools that we get just with CSS alone, so I hope you did find this video helpful, and I'll see you in the next one.